Somewhere beneath the concrete and noise of one of the most densely populated cities on Earth, beneath the traffic and the market stalls and the crumbling colonial walls, lies the memory of a kingdom so wealthy and so connected that emperors in China officially referred to its rulers not as chiefs, not as governors, but as kings. A kingdom that existed for centuries before the Spanish ever set foot in the archipelago. A kingdom whose gold was measured in units that would make modern economists reconsider everything they thought they knew about pre-colonial Asia. If you are new here, this channel exists to uncover the stories the history books leave out and the traditions the world forgets to celebrate. Hit that subscribe button now, share this video with someone who deserves to know this story, and drop a like, because what you are about to learn is going to stay with you long after this video ends. This is the story of Tondo, the forgotten empire that once ruled the ancient world from the shores of Manila Bay, and whose erasure may be one of the greatest acts of historical concealment in Southeast Asian memory. Long before Manila was Manila, before it was anything resembling what the world knows today, the land along the northern bank of the Pasig River was already the center of something extraordinary. Stretching from what is now the congested district of Tondo northward across much of Luzon, a kingdom had taken root. It did not announce itself with pyramids or massive stone temples the way other ancient powers did. Its monuments were ships, hundreds of them. Sleek outrigger vessels called balangay that cut across the waters of Manila Bay and fanned outward into the broader currents of maritime Southeast Asia, carrying gold, spices, and ceramics to ports that spanned from China to Java. What makes the Kingdom of Tondo so remarkable and so deeply unacknowledged in mainstream world history is that its origins are not the stuff of legend or speculation. They are written down. In the year 900 AD, a document was pressed into a sheet of copper and inscribed with words drawn from Sanskrit, Old Malay, Old Javanese, and Old Tagalog. This document, now known as the Laguna Copperplate inscription, is the oldest surviving written record found anywhere in the Philippines. It does not describe a simple fishing village. It describes a society with a functioning legal system, a ruling class capable of dispensing pardons, and an economy so sophisticated that debts were measured in precise weights of gold. The specific amount recorded in that inscription is 926.4 grams, a figure detailed enough to silence anyone who still imagines pre-colonial Filipinos as isolated tribespeople unfamiliar with organized civilization. The rulers of Tondo carried a title that said everything about their status. They were called Lakan, a designation that placed them firmly within the Maharlika caste, the feudal warrior nobility of ancient Tagalog society. These were not village elders making decisions around a fire. They were sovereigns who presided over a kingdom that eventually stretched from the Ilocos coastline in the north all the way down through the Bicol Peninsula in the south, encompassing more territory than many European kingdoms of the same era. The social structure beneath them was equally elaborate, with distinct classes of nobles, freemen, and dependent laborers, all operating within a system that had absorbed centuries of influence from the Hindu and Buddhist traditions of maritime Southeast Asia. The world Tondo moved through was not a peripheral one. By the time the 10th century arrived, the Philippine archipelago had already been embedded in a vast web of trade that connected the islands to the Srivijaya Empire, the powerful maritime confederation centered in Sumatra that had dominated Southeast Asian commerce for generations. Through Srivijaya, Tondo had access to goods, ideas, and alliances that reached as far as India. Sanskritized court culture, The use of writing systems and specific ritual practices all flowed into the archipelago through these networks. Tondo was not a receiver on the edge of a great system. It was an active participant with leverage, with goods the rest of the world actually wanted, and with the ships to deliver them. By the 14th century, Tondo had secured something even more powerful than trade routes. It had the formal recognition of the most dominant empire in Asia. The Ming Dynasty, which replaced the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty after 1368, was in the process of reorganizing its relationships with the kingdoms around it, and Tondo moved quickly. In 1373, an envoy from Luzon arrived at the Ming court, and what the Chinese recorded in their official dynastic annals, the Ming Shi Lu, was not a description of a tributary backwater. The rulers of Tondo were described with the character Wang, the Chinese word for king. This was a designation reserved for legitimate sovereigns, not minor chiefs or peripheral leaders. The Ming Dynasty was, in effect, acknowledging that Tondo was a peer-level power within the regional order. This relationship with China was not symbolic. It was deeply practical and economically transformative. When the Ming emperors enacted their maritime trade ban, known as the Haijin, which closed most of China's ports to foreign commerce from 1371 onward, Tondo was carved out as an exception. Trade with Luzon was allowed to continue, officially framed as a tribute exchange, conducted through the port at Fuzhou. Beyond the official channels, a more extensive underground commercial network flowed through Guangzhou and Quanzhou, funneling Chinese porcelain, silks, and manufactured goods directly into Luzon. Tondo then distributed these goods across Southeast Asia. In the context of a region where China had just shut its doors to almost everyone else, Tondo held a golden key. The goods moving in the opposite direction, from Tondo outward, were not modest. Philippine gold was renowned across the ancient trading world. Archaeological discoveries throughout the archipelago have confirmed the extraordinary sophistication of pre-colonial Filipino metalwork. The piloncitos, tiny but precisely formed gold coins used as currency, are among the oldest indigenous coinage ever found in Southeast Asia. Gold was not simply a luxury in Tondo's economy. It was the medium through which agreements were sealed, debts were recorded, and alliances were formalized. A kingdom where a single debt forgiveness document references nearly a kilogram of gold as a routine commercial matter was not a kingdom living at the margins of civilization. The reach of Tondo's cultural influence is visible in the language of the Laguna Copperplate itself. The inscription is a layered document linguistically. Its base is Old Malay, the lingua franca of maritime trade across the region, but it is woven through with Sanskrit vocabulary drawn from Hindu legal traditions. Old Javanese terms appear alongside words recognizable as early forms of Tagalog. What this linguistic cocktail reveals is that by 900 AD, the people of Tondo were cosmopolitan in the deepest sense of the word. They were fluent navigators of multiple cultural systems, capable of composing formal legal documents in the shared administrative language of an entire ocean-spanning civilization. The inscription was not a curiosity, it was a business record, a piece of routine paperwork in a society where paperwork was already routine. By the 15th century, Tondo entered what historians now recognize as its golden age. Its alliance with the Sultanate of Brunei under Sultan Bolkiah, who reigned from 1485 to 1524, supercharged its position in the regional trade network. The intermarriage between Tondo's ruling family and Brunei's royal house created a political and commercial bond that stretched across the South China Sea. Tondo's harbor became a clearinghouse for goods arriving from the Spice Islands, from China, from Japan, and from the Indian Ocean world beyond. Japanese merchants so identified Tondo as the defining point of the Philippine archipelago that they renamed the entire island of Luzon after it. One Japanese trader, so enamored with his connection to the islands, actually changed his family name from Naya to Luzon. That is how prominent Tondo was in the consciousness of its trading partners.
The relationship between Tondo and the wider world was not passive commerce. It was geopolitical chess, played at the highest level. When the power dynamics of the region shifted, Tondo shifted with them. The collapse of Majapahit, the great Javanese empire that had listed the Philippine Islands among its domains in the 1365 poem Nagara Kretagama, left a vacuum that Islamic sultanates began filling across the archipelago. Tondo navigated this transition with remarkable agility, maintaining its own distinct identity while accommodating the new religious and political realities arriving from the south. The kingdom did not simply absorb Islam the way some of its neighbors did. It preserved its court traditions, its warrior class, its trade networks, and adapted to the changing landscape around it without losing the essential character of what it had always been, a maritime power that survived by being useful to everyone. The physical environment of Manila Bay was itself a strategic asset that Tondo understood and exploited. The bay is one of the finest natural harbors in Southeast Asia, a wide, sheltered body of water capable of holding large fleets, positioned along the great trade routes that connected East Asia to the islands of the Pacific and to the sea lanes leading toward India. Controlling the northern shore of that bay, as Tondo did, was not a geographic accident. It was the foundation of an entire civilization. The Pasig River feeding into the bay gave the kingdom access to the interior of Luzon, where rice, gold, and forest products could be gathered and transported to the coast. Tondo sat at the junction between the productive interior and the commercial exterior, a position that made it indispensable. And yet, almost none of this is taught in any standard world history curriculum. The story of pre-colonial Philippines, when it appears at all in the broader narrative of global history, is typically reduced to a brief mention of Ferdinand Magellan arriving in 1521, and a somewhat longer treatment of Lapu-Lapu defeating him. What happened before that arrival? The centuries of sophisticated kingdom building, the trade networks, the gold economies, the Sanskrit legal documents, the Ming Dynasty diplomatic recognition, is treated as prehistory in the pejorative sense, as if nothing of historical consequence occurred on these islands before a European ship appeared on the horizon. The Kingdom of Tondo dismantles that assumption so thoroughly that one is left asking not just why this history is overlooked, but who benefits from its being overlooked. The Spanish, who arrived in force in 1570, encountered in the Manila Bay region not a collection of scattered villages, but a constellation of established polities. Alongside Tondo sat the Rajanate of Manila, ruled by a leader the Spanish called Raja Suleiman, a name that carries its own history of Islamic influence from Brunei. These were not leaders unfamiliar with power, with diplomacy, or with the weight of governance. Raja Suleiman famously confronted the Spanish at the Battle of Bangkusay Channel in 1571, engaging the colonial fleet in open water. He lost, but the fact that the engagement happened at all, that a pre-colonial Filipino polity organized a naval resistance against one of the most powerful military forces in the 16th century world, speaks to the depth and the confidence of the civilization that had grown in that bay.
What followed the Spanish consolidation of Manila was not simply colonization, it was also erasure. The systems of writing that had existed in the archipelago, including the ancient Baybane script visible on early Philippine manuscripts, were deliberately suppressed or allowed to fall into disuse. The oral traditions connecting communities to their pre-colonial identities were interrupted. The political structures of Tondo's noble class were nominally preserved, with Lakan Dula, the last recognized Lakan of Tondo, retaining his title under Spanish authority. But the real substance of sovereignty was gone. And when a group of Tagalog and Kapampangan noblemen, the remaining Maharlika, organized what historians call the Tondo Conspiracy of 1587 to 1588, plotting to restore indigenous rule with the support of a Japanese warlord named Gayo, the Spanish uncovered the plot and dismantled what remained of the old order. With that, the formal political memory of Tondo was sealed.
But memory is not always sealed permanently. The Laguna Copperplate inscription spent centuries buried in the earth before a local resident pulled it from the mud of the Lumbang River in 1989 and brought it to a collector's market. The text on its surface was eventually decoded by the Dutch anthropologist Antoon Postma, and what it revealed sent ripples through Philippine historical scholarship. Here was documentation, undeniable and ancient, of a society that was literate, legally sophisticated, and internationally connected 600 years before the Spanish arrived. The inscription did not just add a chapter to Philippine history, it rewrote the premise of the story entirely. Archaeological evidence has continued to support what the copperplate began. Gold artifacts recovered from sites across the Philippine archipelago, including the stunning pieces now held in Philippine national collections, demonstrate a level of craftsmanship that demanded mastery of metallurgical techniques only possible within a society that had been refining those skills for generations. The famous golden Tara of Agusan, a seated female figure of extraordinary detail, and the golden artifacts of Batuan, including the grave goods recovered from pre-colonial burial sites, all point to a civilization that treated gold not as a rare luxury, but as a material medium for expressing its most important cultural and spiritual values. The Batuan connection is worth dwelling on because it parallels the Tondo story in its own right. The Rajanat of Batuan, located in what is now the Caraga region of Mindanao, maintained its own independent trade networks with China and the broader maritime world. The Butuan boats recovered by archaeologists are among the oldest planked boats found in Southeast Asia, dating back over 1,000 years. These vessels were not primitive dugouts. They were sophisticated plank-built craft using a lashing and peg construction technique consistent with a seafaring tradition that had been developing and refining itself across generations. Together, Tondo and Butuan offer a picture of a Philippines that was a maritime civilization in the fullest sense of the term, a place where the sea was not a barrier but a highway. What separated Tondo from other kingdoms that have received more historical attention is partly the nature of the evidence and partly the politics of what gets remembered. Stone temples leave visible ruins. Gold dissolves into other contexts. A maritime kingdom whose monuments were ships leaves behind only wood, which rots.
Tondo's greatness was recorded in trade ledgers, diplomatic annals, and a copper document, not in the kind of architectural legacy that tourists photograph. And when the colonial project systematically redirected Filipino identity toward Spain, toward the Catholic Church, and toward a narrative of civilization beginning with European arrival, the older story was not just marginalized, it was structurally deprioritized in ways that persisted through independence and into the modern era. But here is what the ground beneath Manila keeps insisting on, despite every effort to smooth it over. The city built on the ruins of Tondo is a city with an ancient spine.
The name Tondo still exists, still marks the district, still sits on maps of Metro Manila where it has always been, north of the Pasig River, facing the bay.
The families that trace their lineage to the old Maginoo ruling class of Tondo have not entirely forgotten. The Baybayin script has been experiencing a quiet revival in Filipino artistic and cultural spaces, and the scholarship, slow at first, has been accelerating. More Filipino historians, more Southeast Asian researchers, and more international scholars are returning to the pre-colonial record with fresh eyes and better tools. What they are finding, every time they look closely, is a kingdom that was not peripheral to the ancient world. It was central to it. The question that hangs over all of this is not simply historical, it is contemporary. What does it mean for a nation to have been one of the wealthiest maritime powers in medieval Asia and to have had that story buried for 4 centuries? What does it do to a people's understanding of themselves when the civilization they came from is treated as though it barely existed? The Kingdom of Tondo was not a precursor to something greater. It was itself something great. Its rulers were acknowledged as kings by the most powerful empire in Asia. Its traders moved goods across half the known world. Its legal system was sophisticated enough to generate documents written in 4 languages simultaneously. These are not the markers of a civilization that was waiting for someone to come and organize it. The story of Tondo is, in the deepest sense, the story of what happens when history is written exclusively by the people who arrived last. The Spanish came to Manila Bay in 1570 and found something they needed to reduce in the written record in order to justify what they were doing. A kingdom with Ming Dynasty recognition, with its own nobility, its own legal traditions, and its own alliances across Southeast Asia, was not a blank slate available for colonization. It was a rival civilization. Making it invisible in the historical record was not an accident. It was a project. And the unmaking of that project, the recovery of Tondo's true stature, is one of the most important acts of historical restoration happening anywhere in the world right now. What makes Tondo's story so resonant beyond the Philippines is that it is emblematic of a much larger pattern in how we understand the ancient world. Maritime civilizations, because they leave fewer stone monuments, have consistently been undervalued in the historical imagination. The kingdoms that moved by sea, that built their power in networks rather than in fortifications, that measured their wealth in gold rather than in conquered territory, are systematically harder to see. And yet, they were often the engines of the ancient global economy. Tondo fits this profile perfectly. It was not invisible because it was unimportant. It was invisible because the tools historians traditionally use to recognize importance were designed for a different kind of power. The Laguna Copperplate inscription is now displayed in the National Museum of the Philippines, encased in glass, deciphered and authenticated. Visitors to the museum can stand before it and contemplate the fact that the words pressed into that thin sheet of copper are older than the Magna Carta, older than most of the documents Europeans point to as the foundations of civilization. They were written by a society that was already conducting international commerce, already managing complex legal relationships, and already participating in a world economy of astonishing sophistication. The inscription survived because copper resists decay. The kingdom whose legal system it represents did not survive because empires do not resist other empires indefinitely. But the record is there. The irony of Tondo's location is not lost on anyone who thinks about it carefully. The poorest district in Metro Manila today bears the name of the wealthiest kingdom in medieval Philippine history. The area that The area that was once the center of a gold-trading maritime empire is now associated in the popular imagination with overcrowding, poverty, and urban hardship. The distance between what Tondo was and what the name now implies is a measure of exactly how much was taken. Not just land, not just sovereignty, but the memory of having once been powerful. Recovering that memory is not nostalgia, it is a form of reclamation, and the scholarship that is restoring it is among the most important work being done anywhere in the field of Asian history. The Kingdom of Tondo ruled from a bay that looked out toward the entire world, and the entire world came to it. Chinese emperors recorded its kings. Japanese merchants renamed themselves after it. Brunei's sultans married into its royal family. The Srivijayan trade network ran through its harbor. And when the Spanish arrived and built their colonial capital on the bones of what Tondo had been, they built on top of something so old and so embedded in the landscape that not even 4 centuries of erasure could make it disappear entirely. The gold is still in the ground, the copperplate is still legible, and the story, long overdue for its reckoning, is just beginning to be told again.